The scorching July sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling streets of London as James Patterson, a 32-year-old tourist from Chicago, made his way toward Buckingham Palace. His bright Hawaiian shirt and cargo shorts made him stand out among the more formally dressed visitors, while beads of sweat trickled down his sunburned face. This was his third day in London, and so far, nothing had gone according to his meticulously planned itinerary. James had always dreamed of visiting London, but his experience had been far from the perfect vacation he had imagined. His hotel room's air conditioning had broken down, he'd been served cold food at an overpriced restaurant, and just this morning, a pickpocket had attempted to steal his wallet on the Underground. These mishaps had left him in a foul mood, transforming his usually easygoing personality into something more volatile. As he approached the magnificent gates of Buckingham Palace, James couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement despite his irritation. The palace stood majestically against the clear blue sky, its cream-colored facade gleaming in the sunlight. Hundreds of tourists from various countries had gathered around the entrance, their cameras clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the iconic building. However, James' excitement quickly turned to frustration when he saw the massive crowd gathered at the viewing area. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, jostling for the best position to take photos. Children sat atop their parents' shoulders, while tour guides held up colorful umbrellas to keep their groups together. The cacophony of different languages filled the air as tourists chatted excitedly among themselves. Excuse me," James began pushing his way through the crowd, ignoring the disapproving glares and muttered complaints from other visitors. His camera bag swung wildly at his side, occasionally bumping into people as he moved forward. A young woman holding a baby shot him an angry look as he squeezed past her, but James paid no attention. The royal guards stood perfectly still at their posts, their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats creating the perfect photo opportunity that tourists craved. Private Thomas Wells, a 25-year-old soldier who had been standing guard for the past hour, maintained his stern expression despite the growing discomfort of the summer heat in his heavy ceremonial uniform. James finally reached the front of the crowd, positioning himself directly in front of Private Wells. He pulled out his expensive camera, determined to get the perfect shot for his social media accounts. The fact that he was standing well beyond the designated viewing area didn't seem to concern him at all. "Sir, please step back behind the barrier," a nearby tour guide called out politely. James pretended not to hear her, focusing instead on adjusting his camera settings. Other tourists began to voice their complaints as he blocked their views, but he remained stubbornly in place. An elderly British woman tapped him on the shoulder. "Young man, you're not supposed to be that close. There are rules, you know." Her proper English accent only served to irritate James further. "I just need one good picture," he snapped back, not even bothering to turn around. "Just 1 minute, that's all." The tension in the crowd grew as more people noticed James's disregard for the rules. Parents pulled their children closer, while several visitors began recording the scene on their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Private Wells remained motionless, staring straight ahead as per his training, but he was acutely aware of the situation unfolding before him. In his peripheral vision, he could see the tourists getting increasingly agitated as more people asked him to move back. The hot weather, the pressing crowd, and the accumulated frustrations of his vacation were all building up inside James like a pressure cooker ready to explode. His hands began to shake slightly as he tried to focus his camera, and sweat stained the back of his shirt. The disapproving murmurs from the crowd around him only added to his growing anger. Little did anyone know that this seemingly typical scene of tourist misbehavior was about to escalate into something far more serious. The next few minutes would transform what should have been a simple photo opportunity into an international incident that would change James Patterson's life forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines around the world and remind everyone why the rules at Buckingham Palace exist for a reason. The scorching July sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling streets of London as James Patterson, a 32-year-old tourist from Chicago, made his way toward Buckingham Palace. His bright Hawaiian shirt and cargo shorts made him stand out among the more formally dressed visitors, while beads of sweat trickled down his sunburned face. This was his third day in London, and so far, nothing had gone according to his meticulously planned itinerary. James had always dreamed of visiting London, but his experience had been far from the perfect vacation he had imagined. His hotel room's air conditioning had broken down. He'd been served cold food at an overpriced restaurant. And just this morning, a pickpocket had attempted to steal his wallet on the underground. These mishaps had left him in a foul mood, transforming his usually easygoing personality into something more volatile. As he approached the magnificent gates of Buckingham Palace, James couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement despite his irritation. The palace stood majestically against the clear blue sky, its cream-colored facade gleaming in the sunlight. Hundreds of tourists from various countries had gathered around the entrance, their cameras clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the iconic building. However, James' excitement quickly turned to frustration when he saw the massive crowd gathered at the viewing area. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, jostling for the best position to take photos. Children sat atop their parents' shoulders, while tour guides held up colorful umbrellas to keep their groups together. The cacophony of different languages filled the air as tourists chatted excitedly among themselves. Excuse me," James began pushing his way through the crowd, ignoring the disapproving glares and muttered complaints from other visitors. His camera bag swung wildly at his side, occasionally bumping into people as he moved forward. A young woman holding a baby shot him an angry look as he squeezed past her, but James paid no attention. The royal guards stood perfectly still at their posts, their red uniforms and tall bearskin hats creating the perfect photo opportunity that tourists craved. Private Thomas Wells, a 25-year-old soldier who had been standing guard for the past hour, maintained his stern expression despite the growing discomfort of the summer heat in his heavy ceremonial uniform. James finally reached the front of the crowd, positioning himself directly in front of Private Wells. He pulled out his expensive camera, determined to get the perfect shot for his social media accounts. The fact that he was standing well beyond the designated viewing area didn't seem to concern him at all. "Sir, please step back behind the barrier," a nearby tour guide called out politely. James pretended not to hear her, focusing instead on adjusting his camera settings. Other tourists began to voice their complaints as he blocked their views, but he remained stubbornly in place. An elderly British woman tapped him on the shoulder. "Young man, you're not supposed to be that close. There are rules, you know." Her proper English accent only served to irritate James further. "I just need one good picture," he snapped back, not even bothering to turn around. "Just 1 minute, that's all." The tension in the crowd grew as more people noticed James's disregard for the rules. Parents pulled their children closer, while several visitors began recording the scene on their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Private Wells remained motionless, staring straight ahead as per his training, but he was acutely aware of the situation unfolding before him. In his peripheral vision, he could see the tourists getting increasingly agitated as more people asked him to move back. The hot weather, the pressing crowd, and the accumulated frustrations of his vacation were all building up inside James like a pressure cooker ready to explode. His hands began to shake slightly as he tried to focus his camera, and sweat stained the back of his shirt. The disapproving murmurs from the crowd around him only added to his growing anger. Little did anyone know that this seemingly typical scene of tourist misbehavior was about to escalate into something far more serious. The next few minutes would transform what should have been a simple photo opportunity into an international incident that would change James Patterson's life forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines around the world and remind everyone why the rules at Buckingham Palace exist for a reason. As the midday sun continued to blaze overhead, the situation at Buckingham Palace's viewing area grew increasingly tense. James Patterson's face had turned a deeper shade of red, not just from the heat, but from rising anger. His expensive camera dangled around his neck as he tried repeatedly to position himself for the perfect shot, each attempt more aggressive than the last. "Look, mate, we're all trying to get photos here," a young Australian tourist called out from behind him. "You can't hog the whole space to yourself." Several others in the crowd nodded in agreement, and a chorus of frustrated sighs echoed through the gathering. Private Thomas Wells remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training demanded. Despite the growing commotion, his posture was impeccable, though tiny beads of sweat were now visible on his forehead beneath his bearskin hat. The weight of his ceremonial uniform felt particularly heavy in the summer heat, but years of discipline kept him motionless. James attempted to take a selfie, stretching his arm out while backing up even closer to the royal guard. His elbow nearly grazed Private Wells' uniform, causing several onlookers to gasp. A plainclothes security officer, who had been monitoring the situation, stepped forward. "Sir, this is your final warning. Please step back behind the barrier immediately," the security officer said firmly, his hand resting near his radio. James shot him a defiant look, but took a small step backward, muttering under his breath about British stuck-up attitudes. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip watched the scene unfold with wide eyes as their teacher tried to hustle them away from the growing tension. Tourists from various countries had their phones out, recording the incident, expecting something newsworthy to happen. "I paid good money to visit this place," James suddenly announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "These guards are just for show anyway. They're like toy soldiers for tourists to look at." Private Wells felt a slight sting at these words but maintained his composure. In his 2 years of service as a royal guard, he had witnessed countless tourist antics, but something about this particular situation felt different, more volatile. A middle-aged woman in a flowery dress tried a different approach. "Dear, why don't you join our group? We have a perfect viewing spot just over here," she offered kindly, hoping to diffuse the situation. But James ignored her, his attention now fully focused on trying to provoke a reaction from the stoic guard. "Hey, Mr. Guard," James called out, waving his hand in front of Private Wells' face. "Do you ever blink? Or are you just a robot in fancy dress?" His voice had taken on a mocking tone that made several nearby children shrink behind their parents. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle. Some tourists had abandoned their own photo opportunities to watch the drama unfold. The atmosphere had shifted from typical tourist excitement to uncomfortable tension. 2 other royal guards at nearby posts had noticed the commotion but maintained their positions, though they were prepared to act if necessary. The palace's security cameras had already zoomed in on the scene, and additional plainclothes officers were discreetly moving into position around the area. James, emboldened by the attention he was receiving, decided to up the ante. He pulled out his water bottle and pretended to take a drink, deliberately allowing some water to splash near Private Wells' perfectly polished boots. A collective gasp arose from the crowd. "That's enough," shouted someone from the back of the crowd. "Show some respect." But James was beyond hearing reason now. The accumulated frustrations of his troubled vacation, the heat, and the perceived slights from everyone around him had pushed him to a breaking point. His hands were shaking, and his face had taken on an almost purple hue. Private Wells could sense the situation deteriorating rapidly. Through his peripheral vision, he noticed James's erratic movements becoming more aggressive. Years of military training had taught him to recognize the signs of imminent conflict, and every instinct told him this tourist was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Some parents began ushering their children away, while others stood transfixed, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. The next few moments would transform this tourist's visit to Buckingham Palace into something that would make headlines across the globe. Little did anyone know that James Patterson was about to make a decision that would not only ruin his vacation, but potentially change the course of his life forever. The moment that would change James Patterson's life forever unfolded in mere seconds. Standing in front of Buckingham Palace under the scorching sun, his frustration finally boiled over into an act of shocking recklessness. Looking down at his feet, James noticed the decorative gravel that lined the palace grounds. His eyes darted between the small stones and Private Wells' impassive face. In that split second, rational thought abandoned him completely. Without warning, he bent down and scooped up a handful of the fine gravel and sand. "Let's see if you can keep that straight face now," James shouted, his voice cracking with anger. Before anyone could react, he flung the mixture of sand and small stones directly at Private Wells' face. Time seemed to slow down as the particles flew through the air. Private Wells, caught completely off guard, couldn't avoid the assault. The sand struck his face, with some particles getting into his eyes and mouth. Despite the sudden attack, years of military discipline kept him standing at attention, though his eyes were now tightly shut against the burning sensation. The crowd erupted in chaos. Screams and shouts of horror echoed across the palace grounds. Parents quickly pulled their children away from the scene, while others stood frozen in shock, their phones still recording the unthinkable incident. "Oh my God!" a woman screamed. "Someone stop him." A Japanese tourist who had been recording the entire confrontation dropped her camera in shock. "Sekirata Owende, call security," she shouted to her companion. The two nearest royal guards immediately broke protocol, rushing to their colleague's aid. Private Wells, still maintaining remarkable composure despite the pain, remained at his post even as tears streamed down his face, washing away some of the sand. James, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what he had done, took a step backward. The anger that had consumed him moments ago was rapidly being replaced by fear as he saw plainclothes security officers emerging from various positions around the palace grounds. "Stay where you are," commanded one of the security officers, his hand already on his radio calling for backup. But panic had taken hold of James, and his fight-or-flight response kicked in. I didn't mean to," he stammered, but his words were cut short as he turned and began pushing his way through the stunned crowd. Meanwhile, Private Wells was receiving immediate attention from his fellow guards. A military medic, who had been stationed nearby, rushed forward with an emergency eye wash kit. The proud soldier's uniform, which had been immaculate moments ago, was now dusted with sand and gravel. "Clear the area. Everyone step back," ordered another security officer as he established a perimeter around the injured guard. The crowd, still in shock, began to move back, many still recording the aftermath on their phones. Medical personnel arrived within minutes, carefully examining Private Wells' eyes. The initial assessment suggested that while painful, the injuries weren't likely to cause permanent damage, a small mercy in an otherwise terrible situation. The palace grounds had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Police sirens could be heard approaching in the distance, and the usual tourist activities had come to a complete halt. Palace staff quickly began ushering visitors away from the immediate area, while security teams coordinated their response. Social media was already exploding with videos of the incident. Within minutes, #Buckingham Palace assault was trending on various platforms, and news vans were racing toward the scene from across London. Private Wells, finally allowed to break his stance, sat on a chair brought by the medical team as they continued to flush his eyes. Despite the pain and indignity of the attack, he maintained a remarkable level of professionalism, answering the medic's questions calmly and clearly. "I need a description of the perpetrator," demanded a police officer who had just arrived on the scene. Dozens of tourists immediately held up their phones, showing clear footage of James before and during the attack. The palace's own security cameras had captured every angle of the incident in high definition, and facial recognition software was already running through their databases. What James didn't realize as he fled was that his image was being distributed to every police officer and security camera operator in central London. As medical staff continued treating Private Wells and security forces coordinated their search for James, one thing was certain: this would be remembered as one of the most shocking incidents in recent Buckingham Palace history, and the consequences for the perpetrator would be severe. The hunt for the American tourist who dared to assault a royal guard was now officially underway. Within minutes of the assault, Buckingham Palace transformed into a hub of intense activity. Police vehicles with flashing lights arrived at the palace gates, their sirens cutting through the usual tourist chatter. Metropolitan police officers quickly established a wider security perimeter while palace security coordinated their response from their high-tech control room. Inside the palace's security center, operators watched the incident replay on multiple screens. The head of security, Commander Richard Barnes, a former military officer with 20 years of experience, took immediate control of the situation. "I want every CCTV camera in a 2-mile radius tracking this individual," Commander Barnes ordered, his eyes fixed on the crystal-clear footage of James Patterson's face. "Alert all transport hubs, tube stations, bus terminals, and taxi ranks. This suspect must not leave central London." Meanwhile, in a quiet room away from the chaos, Private Thomas Wells was receiving medical attention. The palace doctor, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, carefully examined his eyes while a police officer stood by to take his statement. "You're lucky, Private Wells," Dr. Mitchell said as she completed her examination. "The sand caused some minor corneal abrasions, but there should be no permanent damage. However, you'll need to use these eye drops every few hours for the next few days." Private Wells nodded stoically, though his eyes were still red and irritated. "Thank you, Doctor. When can I return to duty?" "Always the soldier," Dr. Mitchell smiled sympathetically. Outside, the palace grounds were buzzing with activity. Detective Inspector Laura Thompson of the Metropolitan Police had taken charge of the criminal investigation. She stood with her team, reviewing the evidence already gathered. "Right? What do we know about our suspect?" she asked, pen poised over her notebook. "James Patterson, American citizen," reported Sergeant Mike Chen, reading from his tablet. "We got his details from the palace's facial recognition system matching tourist visa records. Entered the UK 3 days ago, staying at the Regent Hotel in Soho. Passport shows he's from Chicago, Illinois." Detective Thompson nodded. "Good. Get units to the hotel immediately, though I doubt he's foolish enough to return there. What about his phone?" "Tech team's already tracking it," Sergeant Chen replied. "He's got it turned on, making our job easier. Signal shows he's moving south toward Victoria Station." As the police coordinated their efforts, the palace's public relations team was already managing the fallout. Patricia Reynolds, the head of communications, was drafting an official statement while fielding calls from news organizations worldwide. "Yes, I can confirm there was an incident involving a tourist and a member of the Queen's Guard," she repeated for what felt like the 100th time. "No, I cannot provide details of the ongoing investigation. A formal statement will be released within the hour." The American embassy had also been notified, and their representatives were already en route to assist with the situation. The assault of a royal guard was not just a criminal matter, but a potential diplomatic incident. Back in the security control room, operators tracked James's movement through London's extensive network of surveillance cameras. They watched as he pushed through crowds, occasionally looking over his shoulder, his Hawaiian shirt making him easy to spot. "Target is approaching Victoria Station," announced one operator. "All units in the area have been notified." Commander Barnes picked up his secure phone. "Close down Victoria Station," he ordered. "I want every entrance and exit covered. Alert British Transport Police to begin platform sweeps." The news of the incident had spread rapidly across social media. Tourists who had witnessed the attack posted their videos online, and hashtag Buckingham Palace assault was now the top trending topic in the UK. News helicopters circled overhead, trying to catch glimpses of the police operation. Private Wells's fellow guards, though maintaining their posts, were quietly seething at the attack on one of their own. The Queen's Guard was more than just a tourist attraction. They were highly trained soldiers with a proud history of service to the Crown. "All units be advised," crackled the police radio. "Suspect is considered unpredictable and has demonstrated violent behavior. Approach with caution, but remember this is a high-profile arrest. We need this done by the book." As the afternoon sun continued to beat down on London, the net was closing in on James Patterson. What had started as a moment of uncontrolled rage was about to become one of the most regrettable decisions of his life. The chase was on, and it was only a matter of time before London's sophisticated security apparatus would catch up with the American tourist who had dared to assault a royal guard. James Patterson ran through the streets of London like a man possessed, his Hawaiian shirt now soaked with sweat and his camera bouncing wildly against his chest. His mind raced with panic as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The crowded streets of Victoria became his desperate maze of escape. Pushing past tourists and locals alike, James ducked into a narrow alleyway behind a row of shops. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Taking out his phone with trembling hands, he quickly searched for flights leaving London, not realizing that this very action was helping the authorities track his location. "Sir, you can't come through here," called out a delivery worker as James tried to cut through a service entrance. Ignoring the warning, he pushed past boxes of vegetables and startled kitchen staff, emerging onto another busy street. Meanwhile, the police operation to capture him was running with military precision. Detective Inspector Thompson had set up a mobile command center near Victoria Station, coordinating with dozens of officers who were strategically positioned throughout the area. "Target spotted on Buckingham Palace Road, heading toward Victoria Coach Station," crackled a voice over the police radio. "He's changed direction twice in the last 5 minutes, showing signs of disorientation." James ducked into a crowded Café Nero, trying to blend in with the customers. His hands shook as he ordered a bottle of water, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The teenage barista, who had just seen the viral videos of the palace incident on her phone, recognized him immediately. "It's him," she whispered to her colleague, discreetly sending a text to the police tip line while pretending to make coffee. Outside, plainclothes officers were closing in. They moved carefully through the crowds, communicating through hidden earpieces. Tourist buses and black cabs passed by, their drivers unaware they were part of one of the largest manhunts central London had seen this year. James left the cafe through its back door, emerging into another alley. The sound of police sirens in the distance made him jump. He pulled out his phone again, this time searching for the nearest underground station, inadvertently providing another digital breadcrumb for the authorities to follow. "All units be advised," came the update from the command center. "Suspect's phone signal indicates movement toward Pimlico Underground Station. All exits are now covered. Transport police are clearing the platforms." In his panic, James made a crucial mistake. Instead of disposing of his phone, which was acting like a digital beacon, he kept it with him, desperately trying to find an escape route. Each time he checked Google Maps, his location was being relayed to the pursuing officers. The summer afternoon crowds provided both help and hindrance to James. While they offered cover, they'd also slowed his progress. Tourists with suitcases and shopping bags became obstacles in his path as he tried to navigate the busy streets. "Excuse me, coming through," he shouted, pushing past a group of Japanese tourists who were consulting a map. One of them recognized him from the social media videos and quickly pointed him out to a nearby police officer. James's stamina was beginning to fail. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and growing dread. His chest burned with each breath, and his legs felt like lead. The weight of his camera and bag, which he hadn't thought to discard, dragged him down further. At the police command center, Detective Thompson watched the pursuit unfold on multiple screens. "He's running out of options," she observed. "All major transport hubs are covered, and he's moving in circles now." The net was tightening. Police vehicles had quietly blocked off several side streets, while officers on foot maintained discreet positions at key intersections. Above, a police helicopter maintained visual contact, though it stayed high enough not to alert the suspect to its presence. James stumbled into St. James's Park, hoping to lose his pursuers among the trees and walkways. But the park, usually a peaceful haven, had become another part of the trap. Plainclothed officers posing as joggers and tourists were already in position, watching his every move. The pursuit was entering its final phase, and James Patterson, the tourist who had dared to assault a royal guard, was running out of both energy and options. Little did he know that his next decision would lead him directly into the waiting arms of London's finest. Exhausted and desperate, James Patterson stumbled down the steps of Pimlico Underground Station, unaware that he was walking straight into a carefully orchestrated trap. The usually busy station was eerily quiet, with only a few carefully positioned plainclothes officers pretending to read newspapers or check their phones. Sweat dripped from his face as he approached the ticket barrier. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his Oyster card, dropping it twice before managing to tap it on the reader. The station attendant, who had been briefed about the situation, carefully avoided making eye contact while pressing a hidden alert button under his desk. "The suspect has entered Pimlico Station," whispered the attendant into his concealed microphone, moving toward the Victoria Line platforms. James made his way down the escalator, his legs burning from the extended chase. His once bright Hawaiian shirt was now dark with sweat, and his camera, still hanging around his neck, felt like a lead weight. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the tiled walls of the nearly empty station. Underground, transport police officers were strategically positioned on both platforms. Two female officers sat on a bench, pretending to be tourists consulting a tube map. A male officer in casual clothes leaned against a pillar, seemingly absorbed in his phone. None of them gave any indication that they were waiting for James. The electronic board showed 3 minutes until the next southbound train. James paced nervously, constantly looking over his shoulder. The few genuine passengers on the platform gave him a wide berth, instinctively sensing his agitation. "Stand by," came the quiet command through the officer's earpieces. "Wait until he's away from the platform edge." James heard the rumble of an approaching train from the northbound tunnel. As he turned to look, Detective Inspector Thompson and 4 other officers emerged from the station's service door behind him. Simultaneously, the plainclothes officers on the platform moved into position. "James Patterson," Detective Thompson called out firmly but calmly. Metropolitan Police. Please stay exactly where you are. James froze, his eyes darting between the approaching officers and the platform edge. The northbound train thundered into the station, creating a rush of wind that ruffled his disheveled hair. Don't even think about it, warned a tall officer who had positioned himself between James and the platform edge. It's over, sir. Let's do this the easy way. Passengers on the newly arrived train pressed against the windows, phones recording, as they witnessed the unfolding scene. The train driver, having been alerted to the situation, kept the doors closed. I didn't mean to, James started to say, his voice cracking. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape was finally giving way to the crushing reality of his situation. Put your hands where we can see them, instructed Detective Thompson, her voice steady and professional. Turn around slowly and face the wall. James complied, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Two officers approached carefully, one removing the camera from around his neck while the other began the arrest procedure. James Patterson, you are under arrest for assaulting a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, Detective Thompson stated clearly as handcuffs were applied. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. The arrest was quick and professional. Within minutes, James was being escorted up the station steps, flanked by officers. Above ground, a police van waited, its blue lights reflecting off the buildings in the late afternoon sun. News photographers, who had been tipped off about the operation, captured the moment as James was led to the van. His Hawaiian shirt and tourist appearance created a stark contrast against the professional uniforms of the officers escorting him. Suspect is in custody, Detective Thompson reported into her radio. Transport to Charing Cross Police Station commencing. As the van doors closed behind him, James caught a final glimpse of central London through the window. The tourist attractions he had come to visit now seemed like a distant dream. His vacation had transformed into a nightmare of his own making, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The van pulled away from the curb, its blue lights still flashing, carrying James toward a very different kind of London experience than he had planned. One that would begin in a police station and likely end in a courtroom. Inside the interview room at Charing Cross Police Station, James Patterson sat slumped in his chair, the gravity of his actions finally sinking in. The room's stark fluorescent lighting highlighted the dark circles under his eyes and his crumpled Hawaiian shirt, now a symbol of his tourist dreams turned nightmare. Detective Inspector Thompson sat across from him, reviewing the evidence laid out on the metal table. High-definition photographs from palace security cameras, dozens of tourist videos, and medical reports detailing Private Wells's injuries. James's passport lay at the corner of the table, a reminder of how far from home he now found himself. Mr. Patterson, Detective Thompson began, her voice professional but firm. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Would you like to tell us what happened in your own words? James lifted his head, his eyes red from exhaustion and emotion. I lost control, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Everything on this trip had gone wrong, and I just snapped. I never meant to hurt anyone. Meanwhile, at the American Embassy in London, officials were dealing with a diplomatic incident they hadn't expected. The embassy's legal attaché was on the phone with the State Department, explaining how an American tourist had managed to create an international incident at one of Britain's most iconic locations. The media coverage is extensive, the attaché reported. Every major news network is running the story, and social media is overwhelming. We need to handle this carefully. Back at Buckingham Palace, Private Thomas Wells was preparing to give an official statement. Despite his injury, he maintained his military bearing as he sat before palace officials and police representatives. Private Wells has declined to press additional personal charges, his commanding officer announced. However, the assault on a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. In the police station's custody suite, James was being processed. His fingerprints and DNA samples were taken, and his belongings were catalogued and sealed in evidence bags. His phone, which had helped track him down, was now being examined by digital forensics experts. Your court appearance is scheduled for tomorrow morning, a custody officer informed him. The American Embassy has been notified, and a representative will be present. You have the right to legal representation, which will be provided if you cannot afford it. News of James's capture spread quickly. Outside the police station, reporters gathered, their cameras ready for any glimpse of the American tourist who had become infamous in less than a day. Social media continued to buzz with videos of both the assault and the arrest, with hashtag Buckingham Palace attacker trending worldwide. In Chicago, James's family watched in horror as their son's face appeared on every major news network. His mother was on the phone with travel agents, booking an emergency flight to London, while his father contacted family friends in search of a good international lawyer. The next morning, James appeared before the magistrate's court. Gone was the tourist attire, replaced by a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. The judge looked down at him sternly as the charges were read. The defendant is charged with assault on a member of the armed forces, disorderly conduct on royal grounds, and resisting arrest, the prosecutor announced. Given the serious nature of these offenses and their location, we request that bail be denied. The implications of his actions were now laid bare: potential jail time, a criminal record, and a likely ban from entering the United Kingdom in the future. His dream vacation had transformed into a legal nightmare that would follow him for years to come. Private Wells, now recovering at home, received hundreds of messages of support from around the world. The palace announced that he would receive a commendation for his remarkable restraint and professionalism during the incident. As James was led back to his cell, he caught sight of a newspaper headline: "Tourist's Temple Tantrum Leads to Time Behind Bars." The story of his meltdown would serve as a cautionary tale for years to come, a reminder that a moment of uncontrolled anger could have life-altering consequences. The incident would go down in Buckingham Palace history, not just as a security breach, but as a testament to the professionalism of the royal guards and the efficiency of London's law enforcement. For James Patterson, it would be remembered as the day a dream vacation became a permanent mark on his record, all because he couldn't control his temper under the watchful eyes of one of Britain's most iconic institutions.